How many people got an email from Nikhil yesterday telling you it was Bow Tie Wednesday? So, I thought it was just me. And don't worry about my hand. My wife told me not to take that last biscuit, and that's what happens when you live in Georgia. We've talked a lot this morning, and you've heard a lot about data, and I don't know if people really fully appreciate, and this is a little difficult to see, but data, and I know we all intuitively understand that data is exploding in the world. You know how much, because like a lot of things in technology, we kind of keep data and just keep building on top of it. Well, if you look just since 2005, we had about 1 zettabyte, which is 1 billion terabytes worldwide. By the end of this year, they think it's going to be 8 billion terabytes of data in the world. So it's a pretty monstrous thing when you look at it, because like I said, a lot of data, we just keep adding on the pile, and we're not really looking at innovative ways. And there's tons of data, and everybody this morning has talked about that, about all the data that's kind of sitting around here. So I want to talk about a couple of things today, and we're going to get into some of the stuff that DNR has done, but I also wanted to talk about, you know, where we are, because a lot of the times in technology, we spend a lot of time talking about the how. You know, unfortunately, how many people, does everybody here work in IT? How many people here work in IT? Yeah. We're always looking for the next shiny thing, right? And so we're looking at the how things are going to happen, but we don't spend as much time talking about the what and the who. And that's what I'm going to spend some time talking about. And I want you to think about the reasons and how technology has gone. Really, you know, if you look at this, and I just use this as an example about windmills, and is that really new technology? You know, the idea, the real innovator was the one who built the first windmill, you know, because there was a way to take something and convert it into energy. So we do have new windmills, but that's really not innovation. I mean, we found a better way to do something, but it's not innovating. And this is a big caveat. I usually start with this. Those that know me, I say it's the world according to John. So I may have a little slanted view about where I think things are, but hopefully it gives you a perspective of what's going on, at least what I think is going on. And you may not know it by looking at me, but I've been around IT a long time, almost 30 years. I spent 25 years in the private sector, well, a little over 20 years in the private sector, and now almost 8 years in the public sector. And one of the things that, and all those years in the private sector were in banking, and pretty boring place to work, not nearly as exciting as DNR, but one of the things that banks generally do really well is to collect and analyze data. And they do that with the intent of chasing the next dollar. And because there's always, you got to keep bringing the revenue in the front door. And we in technology, because for the state or in the public sector, we don't always have that same mindset. So data is created, it's kind of set here, we go on to the next thing, we create more data, we keep moving down that path. Well, in banking years ago, and maybe you know this, it's been 15 years ago. I worked for a pretty large national bank, and at those days, we had over 50 terabytes of data, and we had every transaction that had ever come through our check or our credit card processing with every SKU and name and address. So we were measuring what people were buying and then selling that information. This was prior to the days of Google, to people that, and they could start predicting. They didn't call them data scientists back then. They were called data analysts, but they were predicting what was going on from a life event. So I say to say that I think we have a large opportunity here in the state of Georgia and the public sector in general about how do we take things that are already existing and make it a little bit better. And I use this as an example. What's interesting is I did a similar presentation. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I put a picture up of a telephone and asked them how many people knew what that was. Almost nobody, besides the teachers. But in reality, you know, the mobile devices were created originally for communication. I mean, and I know they do a whole lot more than that now, but it was really finding a new use for old data. That's really what it started off being. Not a lot different. And if you take nothing else away from this today, I want you to think about that, you know, we have spent a lot of time, because a lot of what we're looking at is infrastructure based, not the how and the what. So we're always looking to throw out the old and bring in the new. And I'm saying you don't have to do, you know, it shouldn't be an either or. That a lot of what's already been invested. And when I look, one of the products we're going to talk about today, one of the things we've developed, we've spent over the years, we estimate that DNR spent upwards of $20 million collecting this geospatial data. And well, it was never really put in a format or in a method that the citizens could reuse it. And so it was old stuff, but just a new way of thinking about the data and how do we analyze it. So I kind of like to put it this way, that, you know, don't throw away the old way. The old stuff was created for a reason, and it may be created in a format or a technology that may be old. But the real innovation starts when you start trying to lay the new in with the old. We spend a lot of time, and frankly, with the digital natives, and everybody knows what that is, they spend a whole lot of time in the new way and don't really understand. And I've had the benefit of a long career in IT, and I see that, you know, there's no need to throw that away. There's a lot of lessons that were learned back then that can be reused, and it's a way to start kind of innovation in your organization in general. So, as I said before, you know, don't get caught up in the old and the new. Understand that there's some blend of those two things. And in that blend of things is where we really have a massive opportunity to innovate. And because you're all in IT, understand that we are the ones that we need to look to, or that organizations are looking to. See, he doesn't have a bow tie on either, and he told me to wear a bow tie today. And how can you do that? And again, this is the world according to John. But I guarantee you, if you look around in your organizations, you're going to find a lot of data that's kind of sitting there and being used for, you know, for what it was originally intended to be used for, but there are probably many more uses for that. So look around and see what's there, because over the years, your organizations have spent a lot of money creating this data. And a lot of it, as the previous speakers talked about, citizens need to, you know, would love to have access into this data. And we need to figure out a way how, first of all, what are they looking for? How would they like to use it? And hackathons, you know, is certainly a great way to go through that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've kind of asked around to figure out what are citizens looking for, and then going back and trying to find what data we have that exists and we repurpose this data. So ultimately, we as public citizens and as public employees, we have to find out what are the uses that my customers are looking for. And there's not an easy way to do that, frankly. We do it through a host of methods. We do it through social media. We do it through email lists. We do it through going to events and talking to customers and asking citizens and asking them, what would you like to see and how does this work, or what can DNR do for you that would be better than the way we're doing it now? This is old data that has been around forever about, and there's just I think it's a 2-minute video in here about how we have implemented an augmented reality program
The Camp Lawton Civil War prison
at Magnolia Springs.
Deep inside the borders of the old Confederacy. Up to 10,000 Union soldiers were imprisoned here. At 42 acres, this was the largest prison of its time. But while the war's most infamous prisons, like Andersonville, went on to become National Historic Sites, Camp Lawton all but disappeared. Or so we thought.
Pay attention.
Park. It was constructed in the 1930s, and with its development,
this way.
pretty much everyone
Pay
has
attention to the
lived in
end,
homelands,
because
Lawton, Civil
our
War,
augmented reality thing that we've built is kind of, you can kind of see it at the end of this video.
2009, archaeologist Kevin Chapman took a look around, and in one small corner of the park, he found dozens of prison-related artifacts and realized this could be really big.
Because the Union Army, led by William Tecumseh Sherman, forced the evacuation of Camp Lawton just 6 weeks after it opened. Then, his troops burned the abandoned prison down. Can clues left behind help us pinpoint the location of the prison and provide evidence of prisoner life? These earth mounds are the remains of that old Confederate fort. That gives us a start, since we know the prison was somewhere nearby. But the precise location of the prison, that's still a mystery.
I would like to anchor the stockade wall in place.
The prison wall.
The prison wall. We have an idea of where it is, but we don't know exactly where it is.
What I want to do is find out over here how these prisoners are interacting with each other.
So Chelsea's on the fort, Alan's in the prisoner area. Meg, you're working to
Wall.
see wall and hopefully entrance. And
Entrance.
Joe's bouncing.
Yes, I'm bouncing back and forth at least for a little while
Me
this
too.
morning.
Me too. This is exciting.
For an investigation of this size, we enlisted our own small army to help. Nearly 40 archaeologists and students are here under the direction of Dr. Sue Moore and Kevin Chapman, the Georgia Southern University duo who located the first prison artifacts here in 2009. But finding anything at Camp Lawton is a challenge, because the landscape has changed dramatically since the Civil War. That's why these maps, hand-drawn in 1864, are so important to our efforts.
Robert Knox Sneeden started making these drawings when he was a POW prisoner here at Camp Lawton, and he completed these illustrations shortly after the war in watercolor. The archaeology here at Camp Lawton is literally guided by these illustrations, and these only came to light in 1994.
The detail remembered by Sneeden is astounding. The location of outbuildings, officers' quarters, the look of the prison walls, even the types of shelters built by prisoners. Here are the two sides of the prison as we knew it on day 3. Just days later, archaeologists investigating this spot on Meg's geophys found posts from a third wall on the north side. The largest prison of the Civil War would have looked
This is some of our
like
stuff.
this. Our discovery ends this 150-year-old mystery, and we hope sheds new light on an American story that should never be forgotten.
I don't want to blow the sound up. Over, okay? So I show that to show some of this data here was over 100 years old. We found a new way. You could have certainly gone somewhere and printed it out and read through all those things and found all that yourself. But in today's land or today's world of digital natives and people that are completely accustomed and expecting to use technology to give them the experience, we had to find out a way to do that. And we took, those maps were taken, they were geo-locked onto our Magnolia Springs State Park. And I'll talk a little bit more about what you can do going out there going forward, but I bring that to show you that we have a way, this data was long gone, long forgotten, but as we talk about our problem statements at DNR, as our customers, our citizens are aging, we aren't attracting the younger folks into that, and a lot of that has to do with with using data to draw them into that model. And this was a way. And by the way, visitorship at this park is up almost 40% as a result of this, mostly relative to school groups that are going there to look at this augmented reality program that we installed there. But also, understanding that we are trying to build tomorrow's customer at DNR today. And you can only do that by bringing them in at really young ages and getting them used to it. So we understand a couple of things. And for those that may be particularly in the recreational or the hosting sites that have to do with the lodging and things like that, generally outdoor experiences, the customer is aging in Georgia. That's a problem, meaning that people are aging out. We don't have an influx of younger folks. And one way to do that is to build a digital presence, to get people to come in and younger folks to come in and start using their phones and using other ways to get them engaged. Also our data, and I would bet if you all look around your organizations, it's the same way, and a lot of it was spoken about today. We have data all over the place, but it's not available in a format that is easily read or understood. There's not a place where it's kind of all brought together into one format that can show the relationships between things, and generally, a lot of it is not digital. And I know the gentleman from the hackathons was talking about PDFs. I can tell you that a whole lot of this was in PDFs. So, and there's a reason for that, right? That it costs less to store a PDF than it costs to store a picture or a JPEG. So that's why we do it. But over the years, the 100+ years that DNR has been in existence, millions have been spent in that data. Some of it's photographs, some of it's video, some of it's structured data, some of it's paper. Well, we have to figure out a way to take that data and put it into a format that is easily consumable on a mobile device. So we started down this with my team, and some of those folks are here, over 4 years ago, saying how do we start digitizing some of our information and putting it into a format that can be used by the citizenry. And over that time, the Georgia Outdoor Map that I'm going to talk about for a few minutes, I never talk about anything in seconds, a Beachwater Clarity Map, and the Camp Lawton Augmented Reality Program. That was our latest release. And then we're working on another thing. I'm actually working with Georgia Southern and Apple now to do a K-12 interactive online book about ecology. A lot of it using the data that we already have. And it'll be the first one in the country, by the way, that will be an instructional book, an interactive instructional book that can be tailored depending on the grade you are in school. Georgia Southern is spearheading most of that. We're providing the data and the resources to help them bring all that together. And Apple's put up a considerable amount of money to do it. That's to come next year, so we'll see where that goes. So I want to talk. The biggest efforts that we've done, frankly, have been the Outdoor Map and the Beachwater Advisory Map. Like I said, we had spent a lot of money, if you just look back over time, and it was all spent for good reasons, right? But most of it had to do with ecology, with environmental protection, with species management, with forestry management. We had a lot of geospatial data, but frankly, up until a few years ago, if you wanted to find anything, you had to go to one of our parks and unfold that big map that you can never get folded back together, and then try to figure out where things are. And when we started talking to our citizens, they just said, that's such a pain in the butt. Isn't there a better way to do that? And so I talked to my staff, we found the data, we got some interns from Georgia State, we got Google engaged, who gave us some back-end architecture space, and we built a solution. And by the way, I was just speaking to the gentleman from GovDelivery. We just found out yesterday it was selected as one of the 4 most innovative projects in the country last year from state and local government from GovDelivery. So it's pretty exciting stuff. It's still being seen as something that's, it's making a difference here. So what was the problem we're trying to solve in general? Basically, if you go out and talk to your citizens, you're going to, and I'm a citizen of the state as well, and I had the same problem. I couldn't find half this stuff, and I work at DNR, so I know that they had no concept of where to go find most of this stuff. Somewhere down in the 8th page off of the 20th screen, you may find it if you know where to look. And not only that, it isn't brought together in a single format, so you can't look at multiple things. I always tell people a prime example of that is we manage most of the boat ramps in the state of Georgia. Well, guess what? Those boat ramps are in 4 different divisions. So, so those divisions, you're not going to find that even on their main page. So if you could even think about bringing it together, you'd have to go to 4 different division sites. Then you're going to have to pull down inside of 3 or 4 screens or pages inside of that to get to the point. And then you're going to have to bring them both up and try to figure out where everything is. Well, this provides a format where we brought all of those together onto one map, and it's just called boat ramps. You don't have to know that this one is in Wildlife Resources, and this one is in the Coastal Division, and this one is in our Parks and Historic Division. You don't have to know any of that stuff. And how did we do that? Like I said, through a lot of outreach. How many people here have ever been to Coast Fest? What? Yeah, my staff doesn't count because I make them go.
Is that the one in Darien?
It's outside of Darien. It's in Brunswick. Yeah. We go down there every year and we set up a tent and we show them what technology we're using. It's really about celebrating the coast of Georgia and all the things that go on there. But we set up a tent every year, and then we take customer citizen feedback about what are we providing you? Are you getting what you need? Do you need something else? Well, not surprisingly, when we ask them, how would you like to see the data? they want to see where can I hike, where can I fish, where can I boat, where can I hunt, where can I camp. They didn't care about, is that a wildlife management area in the northwest region of wildlife. They don't really care, nor should it make any difference to them. So we started with the caveat that everything had to be citizen-centric. It had to come about to fill a citizen need, and although I didn't realize I was using his kind of model, we kind of went down that same path and tried to talk to citizens and say, what are you looking for? And not surprisingly, it came into formats that were specific to our citizenry. And after reviewing, like I said, there's a couple of things we wanted to do. Every solution we go in, first of all, it has to be citizen-centric. It's not about how our Wildlife Resources or our Environmental Protection Division manage their resources. They're going to do that anyway. We shouldn't ask our citizens to say, use what we're creating to run our business and you go try to find your stuff in here. That's not what should happen. We should start, they still need to manage their business and you all still need to manage your business. I completely get and understand that. But if you start with how you're going to deliver the data back to the customers, it has to be customer-centric. I mean, that would make common sense, which if you start with that and build back from there, things are going to get a lot easier and you're going to get a lot more response to your data that you're providing. It also had to be mobile enabled. I was not going to go back and try to retro this stuff years from now. So every solution that we put out has to work, has to be able to render on whatever mobile device that somebody may have. We kind of, somebody asked me a question earlier about, we've stayed away from the native apps, the native mobile apps, mostly from a cost perspective, in that I don't have a staff that can keep those apps, those native apps running, apps that are running on your phone. We don't have it. So one caveat that's not really talked about in here is that we made sure that everything that we do is a web-enabled mobile app. So nothing to download. You are going to need cell service, but it's turning out year over year that coverage is growing exponentially. So it may take a while to get to the point that it's all going to be covered, but I think eventually we're going to get there. So what is the value proposition off of these two things? First of all, you wouldn't believe how many phone calls we get because nobody can find the information to each one of our divisions, or sometimes to our headquarters here in Atlanta. When does the deer season open up at the War Woman WMA, and how can I get engaged in that? Well, I can tell you the people that man our front desk, they have no idea, and nor would I have an idea where do you find that information. So building this Georgia Outdoor Map has created a way that people can go research that on their own. They don't have to call because they can't find the data, and calls have dropped significantly. Not only in our corporate headquarters, in our main headquarters and our divisional headquarters, but to me as well. I mean, if somebody asks me, I'm going to say, go to Georgia Outdoor Map. I have no clue. I work in IT. I have no clue where these things are. So it's starting to show a lot of value, and the growth and the usage is going up month over month, and it's been really cool to watch it grow. But in addition to that, the real benefit for me, like I said, I grew up in the private sector in IT and always chasing the next dollar. Well, one of the things that started happening is that we can see that people are bringing up the map. Where can I go? What lodge is within 25 miles of here? Google launches in the background. It'll take you there. You can make the reservation on the way there. So we're starting to see some of the lesser used facilities that we manage here in the state. And we manage over 1 million acres of property, 160 locations of different kinds. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. But we're starting to drive revenue back into our lodges because people didn't even know that some of these things existed. And unless you were willing to go search it out on a map or somebody told you about something, it was pretty difficult to find. Well, now you can put in specific search criteria right on your phone, GeorgiaOutdoorMap.com. If you haven't gotten that already, put that as a favorite place on your phone. You can find whatever you're looking to do outdoors here. in the state of Georgia. So I have a link down here, and I don't know if we're going to have, we might have time to get to it, but later if we get to it. But this is kind of the way it looks. And this is actually generation 2. We've released a newer generation of this that has some other things in here. And I just clicked on camping to kind of show you what's going on in there. It's Google running underneath. It's data disparate data. Some of it's in Excel spreadsheets. Some of it's in, some of it was in formal databases, SQL databases. Some of it, data was all over the map because it was created for different reasons. Well, one of the things that this map does is consolidates all that into one spot and builds these layers on it. So we didn't create any new data. This is completely, much like the Camp Lawton, we didn't create any new data. That was all old data that we were using. Old data, some of it was like really old data. This is current data, but it's just in old formats that we'd used for a while. How many people here have used this or are familiar with it? My team doesn't count. Very good, very good. It's starting to get some grassroots movements here. I'm excited. How many people was aware that we've created a Georgia Beachwater Advisory Map? This is another new use of data that is currently being collected from Environmental Protection Division, which also is part of DNR. We have these water monitoring stations all over the state. Most people are familiar with the ones that are on the Chattahoochee or if you live around here, but we're also doing a lot of it on the coast. And as you can see, there's some yellows there, but so this data is being collected. We have remote monitoring stations that's collecting and measuring certain elements of the water all down our coast. And you can blow this up and blow it down. I just left it this size so that you could see it. But it's collecting the data and putting it onto a map so you can see if I'm down on the coast and I want to go to a beach, where would the cleanest water be? Now this also came out of a request where somebody was asking the question, a citizen was asking the question is, how do I know? I mean, unless you go there and you look for the flag. I mean, most people that go to beaches know that there's a flag if the water's not good, but you may have already driven all the way out there and you find the flag and now I got to go find another place. Well, this shows what's going on real time as the data is being collected to show folks what's going on in this space. You can also click on it, it'll tell you what it is and all of that stuff as well, what the site is or what the beach name is. But another example of data that was, it's old, it's an old collection, it's being used for a specific purpose as it relates to environmental protection, but that our citizens who generally don't have access into this data, the people on the coast love it because they can tell where I need to go today if I'm going to the beach today. But it's good for y'all as well if you're going if you're going down to the beach and you're trying to understand, where do I want to take my family today? And occasionally that shows up as reds, and that would be really important to know. But I don't think, Gary, do they show yellows? The flags don't show up on the beach, I don't think, if they're in the yellow mode. So you wouldn't even know that. They only show it when it says "Do not swim here." That's when it's really bad. But the yellows means that there's some stuff going on here, and you're probably going to find over time that some of them are yellow a lot, and that has to do with some of the other issues and relative to what's going on in the local environment there. A lot of this I've already talked about, the Camp Lawton Augmented Reality Program, but one of the things, and I guess if you have children or grandchildren, you probably understand, unless you drag them kicking and screaming to a museum, they almost never go. And it turns out fewer and fewer people are doing that. So we have to we DNR, because we also manage historic sites in the state, we have to figure out a way to bring those younger folks into understanding history in addition to the outdoors as well. And we're trying to do this Camp Lawton, and if you haven't been down there, it's pretty cool. If you don't have a tablet, you can sign out one there in the site and go right out into the field. and see what's really going on from the way it looked back. How many people are familiar with Camp Lawton at all? Oh, another old guy, sorry. Georgia Southern worked hard with us on it, absolutely. When Sherman was kind of marching on Georgia, they were afraid he was going to get down to Andersonville, and he picked up all the prisoners and he moved them to what is now the site of Magnolia Springs. They were only there, I think, 6 weeks, and Sherman kept marching, and they picked them up and moved them. But anyway, it's a pretty significant site. It was built pretty quickly. It was used for a short period of time, and it kind of went into the dust of history. But this augmented reality program, and a lot of work done by Georgia Southern to help bring that site back to life. But it's a pretty cool place to go if you haven't been down there. The results, I talked about what are we trying to do here and how do we get people used, and we're using some new stuff and QR codes, but all that's really doing, frankly, is just you can go to a spot in the field, hit the QR code, and then it'll show you what that site looked like with you embedded into that space at the time, which is pretty cool stuff. And again, without the help from Georgia Southern, a federal grant. What I haven't told you, what I didn't tell you was the Georgia Outdoor Map, I think we spent less than $40,000 on because we used a lot of interns from Georgia State. We convinced Google that this was in their best interest to help us do that, so we didn't spend a lot of money doing it. This is another one where a lot of help from Georgia Southern. There was some federal grant money that was engaged as well, so this one actually came in at $25,000. That's all we spent on the whole thing, and that including the buying of the tablets and all that other stuff. But like I said, if you look at the results, this was as of about a month ago. We've had 30 new school groups visit in the last 9 months. So as the word is getting out that there's an educational opportunity here and that it's digitized, schools are starting to adopt it into their programs and bringing it in. So we're starting to build tomorrow's customer today. And overall visitation, it is up over 20%, 400% in the 18 and under. So, like I said, if you'd have taken like my 10-year-old out into the middle of the field and said, look, this used to be a fort 150 years ago. It's just a field. It's tough to get them engaged into this, but this gets them engaged into that experience. And to kind of show you what it looked like, this was the original markers that were down there at Camp Lawton. And this is what we've installed there, these QR codes that kind of, you can see the wall that was shown at kind of the end of the video, but it gives you the ability to implant yourself right into that spot. A lot of it based off of those drawings that were talked about in the video. So I've spent talking about 3 projects that we've been working on talking about old data. Or data that was either created in an old way and still being utilized, or just data that has aged out and sitting there. I want to talk about new data, and you're hearing this, all over the place about, big data and unstructured data versus structured data, and there's a lot of talk. I was, as I kind of said earlier on, I've been around this a little while. As a matter of fact, my first degree was called data processing. It wasn't called information technology back then, which I think is a better word, right? It's about, because really the only technology we're really bringing to the customer is a new way to present data. Data is what drives it all. And if you look at everything that's going on in technology, it's about data. And although data processing was a whole different animal back, 30 years ago, what we're kind of trying to figure out new ways to process data and put it into a format or into a way that is more easily consumable. So one way to do it, and this is, again, this is the world according to John, but I think there's some value into it, is that you need to figure out a way to reach out to your customers and see what they want. We spend way too much time in IT trying to say, yeah, that's what my customer wants. Yeah, I think this is what they want. We really need to go ask them and talk about the who and the what instead of the how, which is where we spend most of our time. How do we deliver this? So we do that through, I call it town halls, but it's really about finding a way to get back to the community, taking what you're doing now and saying, how can I do it better? And that's where a lot of this has come out of. You need to do that with keeping an eye on new technologies as well, obviously, and that's growing exponentially. The good news is you have a fertile ground of data sitting there, and you can use some of those new technologies to be able to present it into a format that is consumable. This is actually a caveat for, I think for my whole IT career, is to continue to evolve your thinking and your infrastructure. We cannot sit quietly and wait for things to age out, because by the time they have aged out, they are past end of life. So we have to keep looking ahead and keep steering the ship to wherever that new technology is heading. And a lot of what's happening now is the data is being built in formats or in methods that our existing technologies may not support. So we got to keep looking ahead and continuing to evolve our thinking and our infrastructure. But unfortunately for, coming out of the private sector, where if I could tell them that the ROI in this was 18 months, they would give me almost any amount of money. That's not the world we live in, at least the world I live in. Maybe some of you guys have a lot more money. I know GTA does, but the rest of us don't. Talk about, you have to figure out, look at the new technologies and ideas, and how does that fit into my space now, or even forward-looking, how may it fit into that space? And there's a whole host of things, but I just put legally, politically, socially, but certainly budget-wise, and start planning ahead for how am I going to do that? Because a lot of the stuff, and we're going to show a video in a second, actually it's of a new program that we started with this year, having to do with, how many people know what a UAV is? Oh, wow. How many people know what a drone is? Yeah, see, we're not allowed to call them drones because that has a military connotation. So I was told, now I'm told I can't call it a UAV, it has to be a UAS because UAV assumes that there's a person in it, a vehicle. Now it's a system. So I don't know. The political correctness of what's going on here drives me nuts. So unmanned air systems. It used to be unmanned air vehicles. And it used to be drones, but you can't really say that anymore because it's Big Brother watching, and we're not supposed to say drones in public anymore. But you need to start looking ahead, because these things are already out there, and they're going to consume you, and you're going to be stuck trying to provide the data into formats or new data in formats or technology that you don't even have on the plate yet. So some of you may have seen, I'm not going to spend, and I spent some time talking at the Digital Summit about the UAV program and how do you start one that we started at DNR. But we started with a couple of caveats around UAVs. To find a more efficient and effective way to capture new geospatial data, because we have a lot of geospatial data. And most people understand the photography elements of UAVs, UASs, but they don't understand how accurate the geospatial mapping is on that. Some of the stuff that we're looking at now from a height of 400 feet is accurate to within an inch. And so it's actually more accurate than sending somebody out there with a tape measure and trying to figure out how big something is. And a part of what we have to do, and I'll talk some about what is our mission down there, but we do a lot of geospatial stuff on the coast. And so we're piloting a program down there now about geospatial data. It also gives us a way to fact check old data with new data. So we've been building, issuing dock permits based on aerial photography and some other things. Not surprisingly, when we compare what the permit we offered, because we control all the dock permits on all the tidal ways in Georgia as well. That's another one of the things we do down in our coastal division. But not surprisingly, we issue a dock permit for somebody to build a dock 100 feet out and 10 feet wide. We start flying our UASs and we find out that it's 140 feet long and 12 feet wide. Well, it's not an easy thing to do if you're going to send somebody out there with a boat and say, you hold this end and let me go down to this end and see how big it really is. But when you're accurate within an inch, we're finding a lot of violations where people permitted for one thing and built something a whole lot bigger. And there's a lot of issues around it as well. And I talked some about the Digital Summit about some of the open records request struggles that we're going through. But it gives us the ability to fact check the old data with new data. It also gives us the ability to take some of the data that we know is correct as old data and integrate those things together. But ultimately, it gives us what the golden record is, because this is absolute. This is way better than anything we could have measured manually. So we're creating new golden records for our geospatial data down on the coast. Like I said, it's way more accurate, down to about an inch, and it's more up to date. Does anybody in here, does their organizations use aerial photography in any of their geospatial stuff? Yeah, one of the things we've had to do over the years was we would purchase aerial photography of the coast, and we would try to measure, count docks, and do all that stuff based on aerial photography that was extremely expensive, and it's done once a year. So, and because it wasn't terribly accurate, we could kind of see when something new was added, but we didn't know when somebody was adding on to something that was existing. That was a big problem. And so we're using that now for litigation, for either we are litigating or we're being litigated against as to we did something we shouldn't have done. But most importantly, we're reducing staff field time. Like I said, we used to have people go out and and not surprisingly, people would know that it may be 5 years before we get to every freaking dock on the coast. There's thousands of them. So how do you go measure each one of those things? So something could be there for years before we would find it. Now we're finding it pretty quickly. And I'm going to show you a video actually that was taken yesterday down on the coast about some of our efforts. So as Sid had said before, I believe that, what is the use case and what are we really trying to do here? Well, we started off saying we're going to talk about compliance and enforcement as it relates to permits and revocable licenses that we are responsible for doing. We're also, like I said, we're confirming the measurements on things, and we're documenting existing impacts, which is something we couldn't really do before. So we can see that if we did issue a dock permit in this space, but it's starting to have a degradatory effect on the neighboring inlet or the piece of waterway that was going on there, we may have to go back and revisit that because we're starting to harm the environment as a result of that. Now we may have to take a fresh look at that. We didn't have a way to do that before, but now we can say go every month to this spot and take a picture, check it at all the tides, do all that stuff, and we can start seeing if we've changed the tidal patterns there. One thing that we haven't stepped into, but we certainly understand that we have the ability to do from a UAV program use case, is pre-disaster documentation and post-disaster recovery. We do that now. Maybe most people don't know we are first responders as well. In addition to all the parks and all the stuff we do, we have one of the largest law enforcement divisions in the state. But and you may have sadly seen that, when someone loses their life drowning in Lake Lanier, that's DNR that goes out and tries to help them recover. So we are first responders for those. We are first responders for tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, because we have boats, four-wheelers, trucks, airplanes, helicopters. We have all that stuff. So before we would have to put a plane in the air to try to understand. Now, obviously, if there's a hurricane hits Northwest Georgia, like sometimes happens, we can go to that spot, send up a plane or send up a UAS and survey the area and try to figure out what's really going on without trying to fly at a higher altitude and trying to discern what's going on. So we haven't built it for that thing yet. We are focusing on the compliance and enforcement perspective. And eventually we hope to get into, you notice we didn't even really get into search and rescue, which is where a lot of states are kind of using it for. But it's certainly with the ability to use heat seeking and other things that are going on there. There's a lot of opportunity there. But with that's coming a lot of data, not surprisingly, right? So what's interesting is that when I ask for this a video that we're going to show. It's about, I don't know, 4 or 5 minutes long, that was collected off of one of our UAS flights yesterday. It's so large that they couldn't get it to me. So somebody was driving back from Atlanta and they drove a flash drive in, and Bethany graciously loaded it up a little while ago. But so we're creating mountains of data again. And how do we categorize it? You know, and the end users, the folks that are flying these things, they think it's wonderful. Well, at some point, we have to figure out how do I categorize it, how do I label it, how do I make it recoverable? And by the way, because we're public sector, we have to figure out how to redact it. Like I'd said at the Digital Summit, we had a test flight that went over we were checking out a dock and we went over a person's property next to it, and we got a request from the local police department asking if they could have a look at the flyover, the neighbor next door, because they believe they may have had some illegal thing growing in their yard. Turns out they did. But now we're into redaction, because if we don't define our mission and only store data relative to that mission, we're going to start running into where people are asking for data left and right about all kinds of things. So, and it's already starting to happen. So now not only do we have to take it, but before we store it, we have to figure out what is the redaction to take everything outside of our primary mission off. So people can't just start asking us, because you know, they can ask for data for any reason. I have to make sure that we don't store it. So another issue that is an IT issue that people aren't terribly familiar with unless you've been down that path. And finally, for outreach and education, and we flew it down at the Coast Fest again, and to rave reviews, flying up over the crowd, trying to show people what we're looking at and what we're doing, and got great reviews. I'm going to show the video here in a minute. Bethany would be so kind, but I wanted to talk about, I talk about rough seas ahead, and I understand seas is not spelled that way. But this is something that I have done throughout my career, and I think it certainly makes sense here in what we're talking about. How do we innovate using data? You know, you got to continue to scan ahead and look out front. You can't be mired in where you are right now, or you're going to lose sight of where you're going to be. And a lot of folks in state agencies and government sector, because of budget constraints, that's kind of where they're mired. But we got to figure out a way to lift our head out of that and look ahead. Keep an eye on emerging technologies. Not that you have to evolve them, you just got to kind of understand what's coming down the road. More importantly, continue to evolve your thinking. You know, I'm not a big Oracle person, have never been a big Oracle person, and trying to take people, you know, it's amazing to me in the years that I've been in technology to think about people are pretty tied to technology. Technologists in particular are really tied to technology, and they think Oracle is the best thing ever. You know, once I kind of moved out of the coding development stuff and I started looking at what things cost, I said, how the hell do I get rid of Oracle? Because it costs way too much. And then finally, what new ideas and technologies are suitable in the space that you're in? Keeping your eye ahead, but understand that there may be constraints that's not going to allow you, at least in the near term, of getting there. So with that, I'd like to show a video of, if Bethany would be so kind, to show a video of one we captured yesterday of one of our missions looking at some docks. I'm sure you all are dying to see this, but it's going to show you some of the docks and some of the things we're looking at from some of the salt flats down on the coast. This is a salt, they call it a salt pan down on the coast, and you can see this dock. This is one of the docks that from this thing, it's flying at about 400 feet. It can measure the size of that dock down to within an inch, which is pretty amazing stuff. But you can also, when they start mapping it time over time, they can start seeing what is the impact of that dock on these salt pans. I'm sorry if this is boring to you all, but it's pretty cool stuff to us. Now, again, they are doing this and they're flying these missions, and we're still trying to figure out, you know, right now we're doing it by date and general location, but we're trying to figure out how do we build and store this data that can be retrievable. Yeah, you can imagine how difficult it would be under current times to get back into some of these salt flats to look at vegetation growths or impacts that are going on. This is another dock that they're measuring. They're measuring that walkway there as well. Well, unfortunately, the reason these things are so big is this is high def. Yeah, and that's from about 400 feet. Yeah. And it has to have that level of accuracy in order to get the measurements down correctly. And understand that that the UAS understands the geolocation it is exactly where it is right now and can measure the distance from there and understand how big the end of that dock is within an inch.
How big are these flying?
We are using a consumer grade one now for our test flights because we didn't want our pilots to be crashing these $20,000 things into trees. So they are still kind of learning through it now, but it's a quadcopter about this big. Yeah, and if for those of you that weren't there, I'm more than willing to send the presentation I did about how do you start a UAV program. But there's a lot of rigor you have to go through in order to go down that thing, and these folks have to be trained pilots and certified by the FAA in order to fly these missions. So that hot off the presses from yesterday, a flight over our beautiful sand flats of Georgia. And that's all I had. Unless somebody has some questions, I'd be more than willing to answer. Wow. Yes, ma'am.
Can you expound on what was involved in your using Google's backend and the learning curve associated?
Your question was, yeah, what was the learning curve? How do we use Google on the backside?
Yes.
Right. We met. When we started realizing we had all this geospatial data and we didn't really understand how to do it. We are a big Esri shop, and as most people know, there's a decent cost with Esri. I go to Google, and Google's trying to push Esri out of the picture, and maybe you know that, maybe you don't. But we went and met with them at they have a Southeast Regional headquarters here in Atlanta, and we went and talked to them, and we talked about what are we trying to do. And it turns out they were starting to build something called Google Maps Engine. And so they said they would be more than willing to work with us on that, and they helped us with a back-end architect that helped us kind of work through all that. What's really not so good about it is that they used us kind of to help prototype it at no cost. We just paid for licensing, and we used Georgia State interns out of their geography department to help do the build out. But once they kind of got that Google Maps Engine kind of thing working, they're discontinuing it, and they moved it into, that's now what's running their Google Maps online. So they don't want us to use it anymore. So now we got to kind of morph out of that into something else. But it kind of got us to the point that we needed to use it. So they helped a lot. And having some some younger folks come that are really familiar out of Georgia State with geospatial data in general, and they were pretty familiar with Google, extremely familiar with Esri. And they were more than willing to come work on a project, which, by the way, the intern that came and worked for it, he was here for 6 weeks, and we presented to the governor's office. So I said, you may have peaked a little early, son. I mean, I don't know how many people here got a chance to present to the governor, but he's 6 weeks still in college, and he's presenting to the governor's office. So it was a win-win, and we've since developed a pretty long-term relationship with Georgia State. We're using their interns all the time. So for those of you that are trying to find a way to add some value to your budget without really spending any money, Georgia State's a great place to go. They're more than willing to help if you're local, if you're close here. Any more questions? Really? So I challenge you all to go back and look around and see what data's there. I also challenge you to find a way to ask your citizens or your customers, what could I be doing better? And you're going to find a lot of that stuff already exists. All you have to do is find a way to put it in front of them. So that's all for me.
Thank you.